I'm going to talk now about origins, origins about origins of species, as well as origins of the theory of evolution, which is one of the most important concepts in biology. So I've started here with a picture of the Earth and this question, where do we come from? This question is something that has haunted humans since we first began thinking over 2 million years ago. And many different cultures, traditions, and religions have answered this question in different ways. Evolution is the scientific understanding of where we come from, and that's what we focus on here. So to help set the stage for that, I've just got a really basic timeline of origins of different types of life on Earth. So we believe that the Earth arose about 4.5 million years ago. The universe started 4.5 billion years ago. Sorry, did I say millions? And the universe was 9 billion years old. So really the Earth is already halfway in, rising halfway through the period of the universe's history. And then it took a billion years to get your first life forms, and that's prokaryotic cells like bacteria. And then it would be another, 1.5 billion years before we get the first eukaryotic cells, so cells with nuclei. Another billion years before the first plants, then the 500 million years to the first animals, 300 million years before we get to the first land animals. And then here's our first ancestors, so not humans, but human ancestors, 7 million years ago. And so you can see that humans represent, and human ancestors represent, a very small portion of Earth's history. So one of the challenges in understanding evolution is trying to understand deep time. Deep time means going back into these vast, dark periods where we just can barely even conceptualize. And so to give you kind of a illustration of this, think about your own family. So odds are you know the names of your parents. You probably know the names of your grandparents. When you start to get into great-grandparents, probably less than half of a classroom knows the names of all of their great-grandparents. If you go back to great-great-grandparents, you usually start to see only about maybe 10% of the class knowing the names of their great-great-grandparents. Once you start to get into the great-great-great-grandparents, very few people know the names. Usually no one in the class knows the name of their great-great-great-grandparents. And to put that in context, your great-great-great-grandparents were probably around just about 150 years ago. And so even for our own personal ancestors, our conception of time going back 150 years is just too much. We can't even conceptualize our own ancestors 150 years ago, let alone 1,000 years ago, let alone 10,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, 1,000,000 years ago, 1,000,000,000 years. It's just outside of the limits of our imagination. And so this can be a challenge for evolution because we're trying to understand things that happen over millions of years and billions of years. So the best analogy I can give you when you are going to come up against this, when you're trying to understand evolution, is to think about rolling dice, right? So if you were to roll dice and I was to say, well, how likely would it be for you to roll 100 double sixes in a row, right? Like if you rolled the dice 100 times and you got double sixes every single one of those 100 times, you would probably say that's pretty unlikely. And in fact, you could do the math, and it is pretty unlikely that 100 times in a row you would get double sixes. But if you were rolling dice for 1,000,000 years, so you just sat there and you rolled dice for 1,000,000 years over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, it would become not that unlikely that at one point you would get 100 double sixes in a row. Because you just kept rolling the dice millions and billions of times. And that's how evolution works, right? The trait combinations that we see in living things seem very improbable and unlikely that they would have arisen. But when you start to think about deep time, how every time an organism reproduced over billions and billions and billions of years, it was like rolling the dice for billions and billions of years, those trait combinations become possible. So I like to say that deep time helps us understand how the improbable becomes possible. Whoops. And again, that's because, sorry, technical difficulties here. There we go. The improbable becomes possible, again, because of the scale of deep time, these billions and billions and billions of years. So the first scientist to really start to formulate this idea and put it to paper was Charles Darwin, and he still retains sort of the famous position in science for that. Even though he was part of a lineage of thinkers, he was part of a growing movement in biology in the early 1800s that was starting to think about the origins of life from a scientific perspective and starting to see that life was changing over time. And that's going to be a theme that we're going to keep coming back to about evolution as change over time. So again, just to put him in the context of his time, I want to talk a little bit about some of the other people who were coming up with ideas in the 19th century and 18th century, and then about sort of Charles Darwin's unique experiences that led to the creation of his seminal work called On the Origin of the Species. So a couple of big ideas and thinkers that Darwin utilized are listed here. And this is just a sampling. He was very well read. He was reading a lot of different scientific and non-scientific works, actually, around that time period. So Linnaeus was a scientist in the 18th century, so he predated Darwin by quite a bit, who first started to catalog unique species. So he would identify unique plants, for example, and he came up with a naming system. So our modern naming system is partially formulated from the work of Linnaeus. So he really kind of conceptualized these ideas, species of unique types of organisms, and gave them a name. Cuvier was a scientist who established the field of paleontology. So he was thinking about fossils and what the fossil record showed us. Hutton and Lyell were both geologists, and their contribution was really to start to understand that the geology, so the rocks, the Earth's crust, these things were changing over time, and that in fact a very small change could eventually lead to a very big change. So for example, a river flowing every day, all the time, doesn't seem like it's making a big change, but over millions and millions of years, it's digging out the Grand Canyon. So that's an example of the kind of geology that Hutton was arguing for. And Charles Lyell added to that by saying not only was that happening in the past, right? So not only was the Grand Canyon formed by the action of a river millions of years ago, but in fact, it's still changing. That a river running today is going to someday be forming canyons or different geological formations. And then Malthus was actually not a scientist, but an economist who was interested in the role of resources and population, and human population in particular, because he was an economist. And so these were some of the key ideas that would influence Charles Darwin's thinking. I got two pictures here of Charles Darwin. This is Charles Darwin, a photograph of Charles Darwin from the late 19th century. As you can see, he's an old man here. And he would be an older man when he published his original work on the origin of the species, and would become this very controversial figure in his old age. However, he was actually a young man when he first came up with the idea of evolution. And we'll talk more about that now. So in his early 20s, Charles Darwin took on a job as a naturalist for the Her Majesty's ship. That's what HMS stands for, the Beagle. And this was an expedition by the British Navy to chart the coast of South America. So the Beagle was going to go all the way around the coast of South America, making maps of the different landings and ports and all that kind of stuff. But as a sort of aside, they had also decided to hire a naturalist to collect specimens of organisms in South America to bring back to Britain. So while Charles Darwin was doing this work as a naturalist, and this is like a 2 or 3 year expedition, by the way, so he's on this boat for many, many years, or for multiple years, and he's going along this coast collecting specimens, and he has the opportunity to make many different observations of the natural world, besides just collecting species. So, for example, he sees places in the South American mountains where there are shells, fossilized shells in the mountains. He sees fossil animals that are different, but similar to living animals. So, for example, a giant fossilized animal that looks very much like an armadillo, but is much, much bigger than a living armadillo. And this begins to suggest to him that life on Earth is not like how it always was, and that the geology is not like how it always was. He also observes a lot about islands, and particularly the Galapagos Islands is going to be one of these famous islands that he sees. And he noticed that life on islands is different. There's much less living things on islands, and islands seem to have different species, a unique set of organisms compared to the mainland. And again, this starts to get his mind thinking about, well, where do these organisms come from and why would they be different? So Darwin's thought process extends over many years, right? So he doesn't come up with a theory of evolution right away. It's these observations, these books that he's reading, they all start to percolate together, and he starts to think about it both during his expedition and then when he comes back to England for many years. And so we'll kind of go through his thought process. So he has several different observations that he starts to think about. So first of all, if you think about reproduction, if every member of a population reproduced, then you would expect that the population would grow exponentially. An exponential growth curve is going to look like, so there's my graph, right? And this is my growth curve. So you get very rapid growth. This is the exponential growth, very rapid growth if every member of a population successfully reproduces. But in the nature, what you see is not exponential growth. So this is not what happens. Instead, if you were to follow a population, it tends to remain relatively stable with minor seasonal fluctuations, right? So not growing, but staying the same. And the third kind of observation is in the natural world, you see that resources are limited. There's only so much food, water, and space for organisms. There's not an infinite abundance of those things. So to Darwin, this suggested that production of more individuals than the environment can support, right? So all this reproduction leads to a struggle for existence between individuals. So not everybody is living because there's not enough resources for all the babies that are made, right? All the baby animals or baby organisms that are made. And so only a small number of the offspring will survive due to competition for these resources. Okay, so lots of offspring. There's competition for the resources, and so that causes the population to remain stable rather than increasing. In addition to that, Darwin observed that individuals within a population show variability in characteristics. So you might have two birds of the same species, but one bird might have a beak that's this big, and one might have a beak that's slightly smaller. Right? So they're the same organism or the same species, but you have some variation, right? The same way that some humans have dark hair and light hair and brown eyes, you have variation within populations. And the second piece of that is the variation is heritable. So that means it's passed on from the parents. So if a parent has dark hair, then offspring are more likely to have dark hair. If a parent has light hair, then offspring are more likely to have light hair. Not 100%, right? So remember Mendelian genetics, but offspring tend to be more similar to their parents than different from their parents. And that's an observation that humans had made for millennia, right? And is the foundation of agriculture, which we'll talk more about later. And so these observations suggested that survival of an organism depends in part on its traits. So whatever traits it has may affect how well it survives in the environment or how well it competes in its environment. And so he defines this term fitness. He says that the fitness will vary depending on an individual's traits and the environment that the individual lives in. So the fitness is really how well an organism survives and reproduces. And I'm just going to say, remember that this is within a particular environment. So an organism is fit for a particular environment. So he puts together these ideas into a broad sort of conclusion or idea that unequal survival and reproduction of individuals will lead to gradual changes in a population. So changes in a population, this means groups of organisms, right? So a particular organism can't change itself, right? Whatever traits you were born with, you have. But over time, the population will change so that the population has more and more of the favorable traits. And this is, again, over time. So sometimes it's a little shorthand for evolution is to think of changes over time. So Darwin originally comes up with these ideas when he's in his late 20s, but it takes him many years to publish them. It's not until his 50s that he decides to publish on the origin of species. And that's because the ideas were controversial within the social and religious context of the time period in England. And so he finally does publish it in 1859. And On the Origin of Species, which is the name of his book, makes two major points. And again, he says that modern species, what are around today, come from ancestors, right? Through descent with modification. And this with modification means change, right? So organisms are changing over time. Their groups of organisms are changing over time. And the how of this, so how are these organisms changing over time, is natural selection, right? So natural selection is the mechanism for how groups of organisms change over time. So in other words, natural selection is the process and the evolution of new species is the result. And I've got this word here, adaptation. So many people have seen this word used in the context of evolution. Adaptation means getting traits that are more fit. So when we say adapt, this is an evolutionary term. And so I want you to be careful with this term. I see students sometimes use this term a little messily because we can also use it in a non-evolutionary context, right? So when we say adaptation, in this context, we're saying evolution of a group to have more favorable traits. Within a particular environment. Oops. So again, to kind of put this all together and sum it up one more time, Darwin's key ideas is that descent with modification occurs through the process of natural selection. He argues that the unequal survival and reproduction of organisms will lead to changes in a group of organisms called a population so that the population has more favorable characteristics and that these changes happen over vast periods of time. And again, it requires variation within a species. So remember that individuals within a population show variability. They have differences in traits. And those differences in traits are passed on from parent to offspring. Now, what Darwin didn't know, but we can add here because of what we know today, is that variation is genetic. And it arises from random mutations, right? So natural selection doesn't cause changes in the DNA, but those changes already exist. And that these differences in the genetic material lead different individuals to be, quote unquote, more fit for a particular environment. That means the more likely to survive and reproduce. And so how does this happen? Through a process called natural selection, which is sometimes termed survival of the fittest. But I don't like this term because remember, it's really about reproduction. It's just that if you survive longer, you reproduce more. And that's really what matters, the reproduction. So the longer an organism lives, the more likely it is to reproduce. So when we say survival of the fittest, we're really meaning reproduction of the fittest. So more offspring, again, are produced than can survive. And this is because there's not enough food, water, or space for all of those offspring. So there leads to competition. And if individuals have beneficial traits in that particular environment, that is, traits that help them access food, water, and territory better, then they are more likely to live longer and reproduce more. And so that leads their traits, those traits that were more fit, to become more common in the population. So this idea of natural selection leading to change over time in a population is the earliest idea of how evolution occurs. And it's probably one of the easier ones to understand. And so we start out by focusing on this mechanism of evolution. But in a later chapter, or as we move through evolution in later chapters, we'll talk about how this is not the only way that evolution can happen, that you can get changes over time in other ways as well. But again, this is Darwin's seminal idea, the idea that would start the whole foundation of biology into modern times.